Hey, what's up, guys? Michael here. Now, according to certain thought leaders and activists, the greatest existential threat facing higher education in America is, wait for it, diversity. More specifically, DEI. Now, this stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it sparked a wave of terror and anxiety once reserved for letters like WMD, STD, or for the kids out there, SAT.
The equity envisioned by DEI advocates entails a lot more aggression and even violence than you might think.
Now, the stage was set last year when the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action, and 22 states proposed 40 anti-DEI bills.
We are also going to eliminate all DEI and CRT bureaucracies in the state of Florida. No funding, and that will wither on the vine.
Also, Supreme Court. I think we did a video about that once. It was pretty good. Check it out. Now, many media figures argued that DEI efforts promote bigotry, and well-funded activist groups took aim at inclusivity efforts by Major League Baseball, Meta, Pfizer, Atlas Air, and more. As 2023 came to a close, the internet's favorite funny boy tweeted, "DEI must DIE." Guys, I guarantee you, he sat on that and he thought about it. And he was like, this one is going to CRUSH, because he's like that. In 2024, it kicked off with Harvard's first black female president, Claudine Gay, resigning, an apparent symbol of DEI rot. Now, if this feels like a bit of cultural whiplash, it's because it is. As recently as 2020, DEI efforts were stronger than ever when the murder of George Floyd galvanized a surge of Black Lives Matter activism, spotlighting systemic racism. A 55% increase in DEI-related roles followed as businesses and governments responded to public outcry. But American politics has a seesaw-like quality, and the tide has now turned. These days, experts are all but giving eulogies for DEI. There are some good faith arguments against certain DEI initiatives. You know, there's pricey office diversity training programs, and many of them have found to be, at best, ineffective in the long term, and at worst, actively harmful, even when they're not being led by this guy.
Absolutely. Namaste.
Also, if you guys have horror stories from your own weird office diversity trainings, please tell us those stories. We'd love to hear them. But there's also a growing swell of bad faith arguments that would have you believe that the greatest threat to American culture is black anthropology professors. So we're left wondering, why does DEI inspire such animosity? What's so bone-chilling about Starbucks promoting diversity in its workplace? And where the hell does America go from here? Well, let's explore it in this video, how diversity became a bad word. Okay, so let's start with a quick bird's eye view of things. DEI refers to a variety of institutional trainings, policies, and practices aimed at remedying systemic inequities, with programs ranging from seminars on racism to the implementation of hiring strategies to add more diversity to an organization. So why do various attempts by corporations and universities to provide things like trainings, mentorships, or more inclusive promotion policies make people so gosh darn mad? Well, the angry backlash against DEI efforts actually looks remarkably familiar if you take even a passing glance at what life has been like for most minority groups throughout American history. Spoiler alert, not good. But parallels to the current moment feel most starkly apparent when you look at Black Americans' struggle for racial equality, where every small win has been followed by waves of anxiety, anger, and violence. What's remarkable is that this kind of backlash tends to occur before meaningful progress is actually made. Now, as historian Lawrence Glickman writes, the pattern is this: American reactionary politics is nearly always preemptive, predicting catastrophe and highlighting potential slippery slopes. In other words, any whisper of change echoes into a fever pitch of anxiety that such change will go too far. And according to Glickman, you can't talk American backlash without talking post-Civil War Reconstruction. Now, in the early days of the Civil War, even folks prepared to fight against slavery often opposed the idea of actually integrating black people into society. It's kind of like when people put those signs in their front yard that's like, everyone is welcome here, but then they live in like a super gentrified neighborhood or they don't let anyone in there, and on the Next Door app, everyone's just like, oh, I saw a black person, they're gonna kill my kids. I don't know. As Carole Anderson chronicles in her book White Rage, this aversion was so strong that everyone's favorite president, Abraham Lincoln, once summoned 5 black leaders to the White House, where he explained that blacks and whites are too different to live together. He then asked these leaders to help him convince black people to just leave America and then resettle in a new colony that he'd selected in what's now Panama. The Central American countries weren't super into the idea, so it never panned out. But it'd be interesting to see what his legacy would be like if that would have worked. But that's just a taste of how even the capital G good white guys were talking. Now, it would take 3 more years from the squashing of that plan and 5% of the population getting cannon fired by their neighbors to usher in the end of chattel slavery. But as the war came to an end, it seemed like black people would finally be treated like, people. As federal troops occupied the South, more than 500,000 black men became voters, with turnout as high as 90%, and black political activism blossomed. But as slow gains were being made, reactionary mobilization was a brewing. Now, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, who called America a country for white people, pardoned many Confederate leaders, which allowed them to quickly reestablish political control over the South and over the black people they still wanted to own. Letting former slave owners take the South back, Anderson argues, effectively laid the groundwork for an unabashed reign of terror and anti-black violence. The Southern elite also crafted the Black Codes, which would evolve into Jim Crow and required black people to sign wildly underpaid labor contracts with local plantations, mills, and mines, or be charged with vagrancy, which is punishable by brutal whipping or imprisonment with hard labor. Guys, they basically just reinvented slavery and used different words for it. And that's going to come up later because we're going to see a repetition of that in a modern context, in case you were wondering. Anderson details the suffocating restrictions on Southern black people. They weren't allowed to hunt or fish and were banned from using any higher wage skills they had, like blacksmithing. And this is despite my good friend Ron DeSantis's rosy claims about the enslaved person to tradesman pipeline.
These are the most robust standards in African American history, probably anywhere in the country.
The new guidelines require middle school students be taught, quote, how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit.
I'll see you at the next family reunion, Ron. Now, this marks the beginning of a pattern. As soon as black people gain any measure of progress, it's met with intense violent backlash. Similar preemptive backlash came in 1914, when the possibility of escaping the violence and oppression of Jim Crow spurred the great migration of black folks to the North, which one Southern leader called the first step the nation's servant class ever took without asking. His white-skinned brethren seethed at the prospect of losing the cheap labor that sustained the Southern economy. So then they went back to the drawing board and they rebalanced the ledgers, and then they offered really competitive wages to, I'm just kidding, I'm not even gonna make a joke. You know it didn't get better. You know that, I know that, everyone knows that. These guys did everything possible to keep them stuck in the South, from stopping trains on their tracks for days to pressuring train companies not to issue tickets to black people, to imprisoning labor agents recruiting black workers, to once again simply imprisoning black folks for vagrancy. See how they do this? They just they make up a concept and they're like, oh, but if you do this, we can just throw you in jail. Interesting. While Anderson notes a whopping 10% of Southern black folks did escape the South, the backlash was devastatingly effective overall. Now, you might say, Michael, which is my name, surely progress is linear, and the racist backlash against black progress that happened over 100 years ago would be the last. And to that, I would say no. I guess I could make a joke about it, but it's too depressing to joke about. Now, 1954 brought Brown versus Board of Education, which nominally desegregated schools. Now, faced with the possibility of white and black kids learning long division together, many Southerners just straight up lost their minds. I would say that seeing footage of how white folks in the South reacted to segregation was one of the first times in my life as a child where I was like, oh, some people are bad. Some things are just bad. Like, these things are not good. Before meaningful levels of desegregation could begin, 101 Southern congressmen preemptively signed the Southern Manifesto, urging the South to resist forced integration by any means. I mean, say what you will about the Communist Manifesto, at least it's better than that one. As historian Leslie T. Fenwick writes, at least 17 states fought with all their might against Brown for more than 20 years, openly flouting desegregation laws and illegally steering tax dollars away from desegregating schools. And it worked. As Anderson notes, by 1963, not a single black child went to school with a white child in South Carolina, Alabama, or Mississippi. And Northerners weren't crushing the integration game either. So if you're sitting up there in Wisconsin or Vermont thinking, oh, we never did that, you guys did some stuff too. And this starkly parallels our current moment. See, as Glickman writes, 1963 is also when the term white backlash was born, used to describe growing opposition to the political momentum of the civil rights movement. Guys, if any of you are starting a sort of like politically infused hardcore band and you don't have a name yet, White Backlash would be a really good name for a sort of like political band. You'd be using the name ironically, but let me know, and if you put out a single, we'll premiere it right here on Wisecrack. Even progressive demographics joined the wave. A 1964 New York Times poll found that northern white urbanites have no sympathy for black people's struggles, believe the civil rights movement has gone too far, and say that black people don't appreciate what we're doing for them. I mean, if you ever find yourself saying like, they don't appreciate what we're doing for them, unless it's like puppies that you rescued and then you're feeding them, you should never say that. And has been the case since Reconstruction, the backlash was feverish even before meaningful progress was imminent. At the time, JFK was pretty wishy-washy about forcing change, lest it cost him votes. To his credit, Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, accomplished a lot in spite of the backlash, pressuring Congress into enacting a slew of legislation for his Great Society that included the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, among other reforms to the social safety net. This agenda, Anderson notes, made life better for working and middle-class Americans, including black people. Within a decade, black high school graduation rates soared from 26 to 41%. By 1970, 66% of black people in the Deep South were registered to vote. Black unemployment decreased so sharply it nearly closed the racial gap. But all of you who aren't babies know what's coming, because where there's progress, there's backlash. Even the pretty unflappable Johnson, whose go-to negotiation technique was swinging his dick, started getting nervous. If they leave that line in here, I just want to note this, guys, I don't get what that means. I'm reading the prompter here, like Ron Burgundy. He really took his dick out?
Yes, frequently.
He took his penis out of his pants and swung it around.
Yes.
How am I 39 years old and a disgusting white man, and I never knew that a former president took his dick out to make deals? This is crazy. I feel like I live in the goddamn Matrix. It's no wonder. By 1966, researchers William Brink and Lewis Harris found that 85% of whites thought civil rights progress was happening too fast. While Johnson convened the Kerner Commission to investigate racism in 1967, he ignored their strong recommendations for addressing the problem, worrying it would upset white voters. Following the bulk of civil rights gains, the widespread sentiment that racism was over and black people were asking for too much set the stage for Johnson's wins to be rolled back by conservative politicians. And yeah, here's where you cross Ronald Reagan off your Wisecrack bingo card, because under his leadership, Anderson chronicles, the gains of the Great Society reversed. Social services were gutted, black poverty increased, college enrollment plunged, and the prison system swelled, mostly by locking up black people. Given this history, and as the media frets over whether DEI has gone too far, it's hard not to hear booming echoes of the same white backlash that hampered the civil rights movement. Also, it's still shocking to me that there's like public figures who are white guys who will go so hard at diversity and how it's bad. Like, even if you really believe that, like, think about the optics, my guys. But the thing that we keep getting stuck on is this. Despite massive posturing from the government and business community, DEI hasn't been that successful at addressing systemic inequalities, at least not yet. Underrepresentation of people of color continues, especially in positions of power, even in progressive industries like journalism, academia, and film. Meanwhile, everything from wage gaps to higher maternal death rates amongst black folks endure. And even as the country panics over DEI in higher ed, fewer than 1% of significant university administrator positions like president, dean, or chancellor are filled by black, Hispanic, and Asian women respectively, and minority men don't fare much better. Now, while we're not fortune tellers, because I'm a good Catholic boy and don't believe in magic, it doesn't really feel like we're on the precipice of massive systemic changes like what we had in the 60s. Rather, lots of these DEI initiatives have been extremely short-lived and performative. Google already disbanded its 2020 initiative and fired those employees, which reflects a broader trend. Revelio Labs' 2023 report found a 40% churn rate for DEI roles at companies doing layoffs, compared to 24% for non-DEI roles. Berkeley researcher Lauren B. Edelman argues that this is because many DEI initiatives were undertaken to cover corporations' butts and protect them from being sued for not complying with existing diversity requirements. It was largely for show and avoiding legal fees, so it's no wonder that the results feel pretty illusory. So rather than having gone too far, DEI has barely gotten off the ground. The backlash against the civil rights movement was at least easy to make sense of. Society was starting to change. But judging from today's headlines, you'd think the DEI overlords were enacting tectonic shifts. But this, as we've seen, is the cycle. Preemptive hysteria precedes meaningful change. And today's opponents of DEI are using a remarkably effective playbook to manufacture that hysteria. Now, to understand it helps to think about what's going on when people react negatively to diversity initiatives. Scholars Eric Shuman, Eric Knowles, and Amit Goldenberg note that when majority groups are faced with DEI initiatives, three major psychological threats emerge. First, there's status threat, the idea that they'll lose their existing place in society. Next, there's merit threat, the idea that they didn't deserve the status they had in the first place. And finally, moral threat, the idea that even if they support equal rights, they have to acknowledge that they've benefited from a system that favors them. And these threats are especially potent at a time when more than 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, making it easy for many white people to feel like they haven't benefited at all from majority status. Opponents of DEI programs weaponize these threats to make everyday people whose lives are almost entirely unaffected by innocuous training materials and hiring initiatives feel targeted. And as these anxieties swell, the outrage industrial complex swoops in with comforting rhetoric that borrows from both traditional American mythos and social justice vernacular. Take noted Spice Girls aficionado, Texas Governor Greg Abbott's administration, which banned DEI in state agencies, including universities. The spokesperson, Renee Easy, declared, "Here in Texas, we give people a chance to advance based on talent and merit. In other words, if you're good enough, you'll make it no matter what your circumstance. Texans, let us know how that's going." Obviously, it's just a coincidence that straight, white, able-bodied men have more merit than everybody else. The effectiveness of this rhetoric speaks to the perennial power of evoking the American dream. For many, it's core to the American identity to believe that we have a meritocracy, wherein with smarts, skills, a little elbow grease, and a whole lot of gumption, we all have an equal shot at success. And this idea both provides assurance to those who have made it that they deserve it, and an aspirational comfort to those who are struggling that their hard work will pay off. Now, positioning diversity programs as antithetical to the concept of merit strikes at the heart of what makes America, America, while also activating those defensive psychological responses to having our status threatened and our merit called into question. Meanwhile, activist organizations like the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism and the Center for Equal Opportunity purposefully use names that evoke social justice, but in reality focus their efforts on fighting challenges to systemic inequality. So like the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, they're worried that DEI is racist against people that look like me. Both the CEO and FAIR websites name drop MLK more than Meghan McCain reminds us who her father is.
He really taught me to love politics. He taught me all about the American political process. I was on his first campaign as a 14-year-old girl, his last campaign as a 22-year-old as an adult.
While the legacy they see themselves as inheriting from the Reverend Doctor is a virulent strain of colorblindness, incompatible with the very sorts of initiatives he championed. Sort of like how recently, when Amy Schumer tried to use Martin Luther King Jr. to justify the genocide of Palestinians, then MLK's daughter had to be like, "Excuse me." This helps assuage the moral threat of DEI, reassuring people that by opposing it, they're good people on the right side of history who just want everyone to be judged on the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And these large, organized, moneyed groups use this rhetoric as they bankroll and publicize these seemingly organic DEI-focused lawsuits and complaints against giant corporations and small organizations alike. Both types serve a specific purpose. The larger ones, like the suit against Starbucks, warn other corporate giants that if they don't want to be at the center of a mess, they'd better change their policies. No one wants to be hit with a lawsuit, which can damage a business and scare off shareholders. So it's better to just dismantle DEI programs preemptively before someone comes after them for discrimination. Attacks on smaller organizations, on the other hand, serve as rage bait to rile up the public, like the white diversity director, who sued a Wisconsin university for demoting her after fielding student complaints about having a white diversity director. Or the lawsuit that attacked a grant specifically for Black women entrepreneurs. Or the theater arts nonprofit in New York City that was sued by a white instructor because their training materials were anti-white. I would love to see those materials, because I doubt it's like, start by mirroring your partner on stage to access their emotion, then do white genocide. Now, we could go on, but you get the idea. The point of these lawsuits is not to win. In fact, plaintiffs usually lose. The point is using the publicity to make the issue feel deeply personal, convince the person seeing it on their Facebook feed to identify with the aggrieved party, and thus perpetuate the narrative that white people are under attack. As Devin Westhill, president of the Center for Equal Opportunity, frames the narrative, while the vast majority of Americans are in favor of equal opportunity, the way in which it's practiced really is divisive. It foments resentment. So the argument becomes, America is not racist, but these DEI programs are making us feel bad, which makes us act racist. And the media is happy to play its part, turning what would be boring institutional bickering into nationwide news. The same guy who proudly manufactured the CRT panic, Chris Rufo, was key to taking down Harvard's president. And his political playbook relied on using a credulous and sensation-driven media landscape, one where divisive issues like race are viral fodder and over-reporting makes DEI seem like the biggest threat in town. Unless you think I'm exaggerating, Rufo's tweets show that he has a clear playbook that he's not secretive about to weaponize these issues to get things done. We also have another video we're working on where I also get to talk about Chris Rufo and his fun plans. People who haven't stepped foot in a classroom for like 30 years are now suddenly full of their deep convictions about how universities are run. And folks who will never work at a Starbucks or a Target are heavily invested in how their training practices might make a white person feel guilty. And ironically, life actually is getting worse for plenty of white people in a number of measurable ways, ranging from purchasing power to health outcomes. But the culprit isn't a few more Black people getting good jobs in tech. It's public policies ranging from cutting child tax credits to failure to raise the federal minimum wage, which are eating away at what little remains of America's middle class. And that's one of the most important functions of stoking racial divisiveness, preventing working and middle class folks from being in solidarity with one another across race. Now, progress is hard when we think of society as a zero-sum game wherein only one group could win and any attempt at improving conditions for another group is seen as an attack. As a result, journalist Pamela Newkirk writes, "It is perhaps understandable that those who historically had all the marbles fear that equal opportunity will mean they'll have fewer. Even those who see themselves as progressive adherents of American ideals might privately and sometimes publicly view diversity as a threat." And as we've seen, these anxieties are basically as old as America itself. As Berkeley law professor John A. Powell points out, the United States is the only nation in which chattel slavery existed in tandem with the development of the working class as an identity. Now, the stark racial divide inherent to a slave society meant that, as Powell writes, although poor blacks and poor whites had much in common economically, racial identity inhibited the possibility of cross-racial collective action and working class unity. Though that quote is describing 19th century America, it could just as easily speak to today's climate. In other words, since the time of slavery, racism has been used to undermine the possibility of a unified working class. And what's so frustrating is that the profound economic precarity we're living through could unite us in a common struggle. But instead, economic insecurity is leveraged to further blame and villainize people at the margins of society. In this way, Powell concludes the American situation is ideal for using race baiting to fight redistribution. The awful irony is that when people treat initiatives for racial progress as an existential threat, they all but render impossible systemic change that could make everybody's lives better. In our humble estimation, we gotta be smarter than the backlash and recognize that this stuff isn't an organic, grassroots response to a slide into totalitarianism, but the result of well-funded, media-savvy coalitions preying on our deepest fears and beliefs about ourselves and our country. Again, with the example of Christopher Rufo, he just says this. He's the guy behind most of this, and he says that's what he's doing. Now, we're not saying that DEI programs are going to deliver America from systemic racism, but we are saying that they're unlikely to usher in some weird hellscape where white people are all forced to be queer communist super soldiers who apologize publicly for being white while minorities and queer people take their jobs. At the end of the day, they're simply a minor step in attempting to alleviate the consequences of centuries of imbalance. But what do you all think? Is the DEI boogeyman just the latest wave of backlash against racial equality in American history defined by them? Can we overcome the divisive rhetoric that ultimately serves to bifurcate the middle class? Please let me know what you think in the comments. We gotta fix this. Thank you so much for watching, for being here, for sharing the videos, for liking, commenting, subscribing, all the things. It means so much. It's why we stay alive. And speaking of those who keep us alive, thank you to our patrons. Seriously, thank you. We have a Patreon community. You get videos early with no ads. You get access to our Discord server. And starting this year, we're rolling out a bunch of new content on Patreon, including longer videos where I talk in depth about philosophical issues, a podcast called Behind the Crack, bloopers and outtakes of stuff that if we put it in the videos, it might ruin my life, plus extra research that gets left on the cutting room floor. So if you got the money, you want some more content, and you want to support us directly and help us be less wedded to algorithms and corporations, think about signing up. There's a link in the description. In the meantime, remember that the thing about President Johnson and his penis is real. That's a real thing that happened. In the meantime, this is Michael saying, don't be a Johnson when you could be a... Nope, that wasn't going to go anywhere good.
Now, another thing, the crotch down where your nuts hang is always a little too tight. So when you make them up, give me an inch that I can let out there because they cut me. They're just like riding a wire fence.